Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and friends from around the world, I'm deeply honored to welcome you all to this special webinar on World Sexual Health Day, organized by the World Association for Sexual Health. I'm Dr. Elna Rudolph from South Africa, and I'm the president of WAS. Please let us know where you are from in the chat. Today is the 14th time that we are celebrating World Sexual Health Day around the globe. And this year, the theme is consent. World Sexual Health Day is a day of global significance. It serves as a reminder that sexual health is an integral part of overall well-being. It reminds us that sexual health is not just a matter of biology or physiology, but it encompasses all emotional, mental, and social dimensions. It transcends borders, cultures, and backgrounds, emphasizing that every individual on this planet deserves the right to safe, consensual, and fulfilling sex life. The theme consent for this year's World Sexual Health Day is particularly pertinent in today's world. The vision of WAS is sexual health and rights for all. In line with this vision, consent is not merely a word. It is the cornerstone of sexual rights and an essential human right. It is the foundational principle that underscores the importance of respecting an individual's autonomy and bodily integrity. The WAS Sexual Rights Declaration, a document that encapsulates our commitment to sexual health and rights, clearly emphasizes the critical role of consent. In Article 3 of the Declaration, it states every individual has the right to make decisions regarding their own body and sexuality, and to give and withhold free and informed consent to any sexual activity. And many of the other articles in this declaration also pertain to consent. This declaration reinforces the idea that consent is not just a matter of personal choice, but a basic human right, and it must be upheld universally. Consent is about more than just saying yes or no. It is about ensuring that individuals are fully informed, free from coercion, and able to exercise their autonomy in matters of sexuality. It transcends gender, age, and culture. It extends to all orientations and identities, and it acknowledges that sexual health is an integral part of human dignity. In a world where sexual violence, harassment, and violations of consent continue to persist, our celebration of World Sexual Health Day under the theme of consent is a call to action. It is a call to promote awareness, education, and dialogue surrounding this crucial issue. It is a call to challenge harmful norms and behaviors that perpetuate non-consensual practices. It is a call to work towards a world where every individual can enjoy sexual health and rights without fear and discrimination. I would like to thank World Sexual Health Day, the whole World Sexual Health Day committee, but especially under the leadership of Lynn Barkley, for organizing this year's campaign. Please visit worldsexualhealthday.org. There is a wealth of information about consent, and we are not only going to talk about consent today. We have put together resources that will help you to talk about consent in many different ways to many different people in many months to come. And this all happened under the leadership of Lynn. Lynn, thank you so, so much. Young people, vulnerable people, but also people in powerful people for whom consent is often thought to be inherent and implied, need to hear about the importance of consent. And your team put together this information in such a user-friendly way. We are truly grateful for that. These resources will help you to inform those around you to have zero tolerance for non-consensual behavior. There are great social media posts and great training tools on the worldsexualhealthday.org website. And Michelle, if you can please share that link in the chat as well, that would be great, that you can access and please share. And again, it's not only on World Sexual Health Day that consent is important. We're highlighting it on this important day, but it remains important for the rest of September and, of course, for eternity. Please share these on social media under the hashtag consent2023. I would also like to thank ASHA, of which Lynn is the CEO, and our anonymous donor for making World Sexual Health Day 2023 such a success and taking it to a whole new level. Just earlier today, I was on a WHO webinar dedicated to World Sexual Health Day, and it had 1,500 registrations. We are thrilled that the message, that this crucial message is spreading globally. As we embark on this webinar today, I encourage you to engage in a meaningful discussion, to share your knowledge and seek solutions to the challenges that lie ahead. Please join the World Association for Sexual Health in advocating for sexual health and rights, reaffirming our commitment to the principle of consent as a basic human right. Together, we can make a difference and bring us closer to a world where sexual health and rights can really be a reality for all. I thank you for joining this vital conversation, and may this World Sexual Health Day webinar inspire change and progress on our shared journey towards a world where there is sexual health and rights for all. So I would just like to introduce you to those of our WAS executive advisory committee members and our executive director that is joining us tonight. You will see there Lynn Barkley, that you've met as the chair of World Sexual Health Day. And then we have Esther Corona, who is the chair of our International Liaison Committee, and she's the previous past president of WAS with over 50 years of experience specifically in this field. We have Dr. Kristen Mark, who is the vice chair of the scientific committee of WAS, and Professor Fernando Bianco, who is a past president of WAS. And then we have Professor Mehmet Sungur, to whom I will introduce you in more detail shortly. I also want to introduce you to Dr. Renee de Klerk, who is the interim executive director of WAS. She came on board in these months leading up to the next World Congress to help us to take over 15 or so projects that we are busy with. So Renee, we are also very happy to have you here tonight, and thank you for your inputs. So the rest of the panel will join us shortly after our lecture from Professor Terry Humphreys, one of the world experts on consent and a top researcher on consent. But first, I want to introduce you to Professor Mehmet Sungur. Professor Sungur is the president of the 26th Congress of the World Association for Sexual Health, planned to be hosted in Antalya in Turkey in November. Professor Sungur is also the president of the European Federation of Sexology, one of the official federations of WAS, and the president of the TACBT, which is the official host of the WAS Congress in Turkey. He is a psychiatrist by profession. Actually, on top of being all of these presidents, he does have a day job as a professor of psychiatry, and he has organized numerous world congresses. I now hand it over to him to give you a glimpse of our congress and then introduce our speaker to you. Mehmet, over to you.
Thanks very much, Elna. Thanks for the kind and generous introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and perhaps good night, depending on which time zone you're attending, dear colleagues and friends. As the president of the upcoming WAS Congress and the president of the hosting organization, which is the Turkish Association of Cognitive and Behavior Therapy, and also as a member of the advisory board of World Association of Sexual Health, I would like to thank you all for joining and for sharing your precious time with us at this webinar to celebrate the 14th year of the establishment of the World Sexual Health Day with the theme Consent. Our dear friend Terry is soon going to make a presentation about consent, followed by wonderful panelists, a group of faculty who are also advisory boards of WAS. So as Elna has introduced them one by one, I don't have to go over them, but I will just briefly tell you some information, give you some information about the upcoming WAS Congress that will be held in Antalya on from 2nd to 5th of November, 2023. As you probably all know, WAS is the main global organization that aims to promote sexual health, sexual rights, and sexual justice within the whole globe without leaving anyone or any groups behind. This aim can only be achieved by advancing education, research, practicing good and ethical sexual health and sexual therapy, and also by providing centers for those who come forward to seek care and service for their sexual issues. Based on this aim, the main theme of this Congress, which is going to be held between 2nd and 5th of November, is chosen as Bridging the Gaps: Sexual Health, Sexual Rights, Sexual Justice, and Sexual Pleasure for All. What an important topic and unmet need across the whole globe. WAS and the hosting organization will no doubt try to deliver you a highly scientific congress, a program that is likely to be completed in a very short amount of time, and which is going to be displayed on our website. Perhaps one of our panelists can put the website address, which is www.was2023.org. On top of offering you a highly scientific program, we hope to deliver you a socially unforgettable congress where you are likely to meet your old friends and perhaps make new ones. We know that the quality of a congress is mainly predicted by the contribution of its delegates. So we hope and we expect that you join us and you participate actively in this congress to turn this ordinary congress into a memorable one. The congress venue is Antalya, and Antalya is the Turkish Riviera on the Mediterranean Sea with 300 days of sunshine and amazing beaches and some landmarks. The venue of the Congress is Antalya, but the Congress Hotel is called the Mirage Park Hotel, is an all-included hotel. If you are not aware of what an all-included hotel is, let me just briefly tell you, just to make it simple. That means you can eat and drink as much as you like in this hotel without paying anything, as long as that doesn't interfere with you to go and join the scientific meetings, of course, but that's up to you. And I think you will really enjoy the time that you're going to spend in Antalya. The resort is surrounded by historical and honestly charming landmarks from Byzantine times and from Roman times. There are places like Hadrian's Gate, like Olympus, like Phaselis, like Perge, like, Termassos. So you're likely to see all these historical sites as well. So please make sure that you make the most of your stay and save time to see these amazing places as well. And promise to all of you that we will be at your disposal to make your stay as enjoyable and as comfortable as we can. So I think that's enough for really talking about the venue and the Congress. Please go to our website to get more details about the Congress, its program, and the whole program will be, as I said before, displayed very soon on our website. We have now coming to the topic of today, which is the consent. I hope that we all recognize consent as an essential human right. Consent basically means permission giving and willingness, not only about sexual issues, but also in non-sexual contexts as well. So it involves the right to bodily integrity and autonomy, the right to be free from all forms of violence and coercion, and it's also about sharing, of course. Sharing privacy, sharing memories or images, touching, hugging, and most importantly, consent is related to all of the people, independent of the age groups, and also across all sexual orientations. So at this point, let me briefly introduce our speaker to you, Professor Terry Humphrey. He's a professor of psychology at Trent University, Ontario, Canada. He has kindly been accepted to be the Vice Chair of the Scientific Committee of the upcoming GLAS Congress in Ontario. He's the editor of the Canadian Journal of Human Sexuality and Consulting and an editor for the Journal of Sexual Research. He's also the past president of the Society of the Scientific Study of Sexuality, and his academical works, actually includes a wide variety of sexual issues, but he's mostly known by his work on sexual consent, in different contexts and across sexual orientations. So let me stop here and hand the microphone to Terry, whose, I think, presentation is pre-recorded. So thanks a lot, and I hope that the rest of the day of this meeting is going to be kind of source for learning, for sharing, and also for actually giving us feedback or even asking questions about the Congress and so on. I'll be here until the end. So enjoy your time, and thanks very much, Elna.
Hello, I'm Terry Humphreys. I am the Vice Chair of the Scientific Committee and also on the WAS Advisory since 2017. I live and work in Canada, where I run the graduate program at in the psychology department at Trent University in Eastern Ontario, Canada. So I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you today on the topic of, let me share my screen with you, on the topic of consent with respect to the World Sexual Health Day. I'll just start this from the beginning. All right. So I'm very pleased to be talking to you on World Sexual Health Day, which was created in 2010 to promote the greater social awareness of sexual health across the globe. Topic this year, obviously, as I already said, sexual consent. Near and dear to my heart because this is my research area. And I've been conducting research on sexual consent since my PhD days back in the late 1990s. Mid to late 1990s. So it's a pleasure to be able to share some of this information with you today. As many of you know, WAS has its own Declaration of Sexual Rights, affirming that everyone has the right to control and decide freely on matters of their sexuality and their body. And that speaks directly to sexual consent issues. So it seems like a really good connection today. Now, as a preamble to today, I'd like to say that when we discuss or consider conducting research on sexual consent, there's an actual range of topics that we need to consider and think about. I think most of us kind of automatically think of couples about to engage in sexual activity, making sure that consent is established. But we need to also make sure that we're thinking about all couples, not just heterosexuals. And why is this important? Well, because actually the sexual scripts that I'm going to be discussing later in the theory behind it, sexual script theory, is based on gender and power dynamics. And a lot of it is explained via gender and power dynamics. It's the main theoretical explanation for attitude and behaviors regarding sexual consent. However, the gender and power dynamics in sexual and gender diverse groups may be different, requiring maybe new theoretical understandings or potentially tweaks to our current theoretical understandings. In addition, as our world ages, we should also be thinking about and researching sexual consent with older adults or older individuals with cognitive decline or potentially dementia. What about sex between two individuals in cognitive decline? What about between someone with dementia and someone without dementia? Given sexual rights and human rights, how do we ensure that all who engage in sexual behavior are still cognizant of what they are doing? What are the critical parts of any, and quite frankly, being cognizant of what you're doing is a critical part of any definition of consent. Also, the WAS Declaration of Sexual Rights for All raises questions about sexual consent and those who are neurodivergent. What we used to call mentally challenged, for example. Again, how do we educate and ensure that those who are neurodivergent have the consensual relationships that they are entitled to? What are there any limits to that? Another context that we need to think about consent. What does sexual consent look like with respect to engaging in communication about sex with new technologies? Communicating via phone, communicating via computer. What does consent look like when communicating via tech, sexting, for example? And what about consensual relationships between those who like to give and receive forms of physical pain or humiliation within their sexual relationships? What does consent look like here? So as you can see, there's actually a range of contexts in which we can talk about sexual consent. Research into sexual consent started by focusing on heterosexual young adults because they're an easily accessible group from colleges and universities where they become study participants for the research that we do. So a very convenient sample. But they're also, I would argue, a good sample to study because they are on average starting their sexual journey, exploring their sexual identities, and typically more sexually active than older adults, but less experienced. So there is that pros and cons to that sample. So this research quickly kind of branches out to explore consent in people with more diverse sexual orientations. And part of the reason why these groups are the first ones is convenience, as I've already indicated, but also an attempt to kind of establish some kind of baseline or a starting point on how the population thinks about consent and how they behave with respect to consent. This is very typical in the social sciences. But there is also a danger to norming your attitudes and behavioral research on any kind of topic on just a young, educated adult population. This may generalize to the rest of the population, but it may not. So we have to be careful about how far we generalize some of the research that we've already come to know about sexual consent. We also know that the majority of published research globally is still conducted on what we call weird samples. Weird stands for Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic samples. To my knowledge, there is very little to no global cultural diversity in the research on sexual consent to date. It is a very North American, Western European understanding. Why is this important? Well, again, weird cultures have a very individualistic cultural understanding of things like personal independence, autonomy, and personal agency, gender equity, a very democratic vision. This has obviously shaped the current research findings and the educational programming on how people negotiate sexual consent. All of which is an urgent call for more global research on the topic of sexual consent. And of course, all of this is a preamble also to the context in which I will situate the research that I'm going to discuss with you today. So in the research literature, Charlene Mullenhart from the United States has been the one to define sexual consent that the most researchers are picking up and using. And that is, sexual consent is defined as the free verbal and nonverbal communication of a feeling of willingness to engage in sexual activity. And although that sounds relatively straightforward and simple enough, all the key elements are essential. So the aspect of it being free from coercion, incapacitation, drugs, and alcohol. That it is a communication, which is a behavioral display that you have to show to another individual. The feeling of willingness is that internal cognitive decision-making that has to happen. So all those ingredients are essential. Wass has taken a very similar definition of sexual consent, which included three kind of major bullet points. The consent is an agreement between participants to engage in sexual activity, much like this definition. That consent should be clearly and freely communicated. The free aspect is part of both definitions. And then a verbal and affirmative expression of consent can help both you and your partner understand and respect each other's boundaries. So sexual consent is essentially giving permission for sexual activity. And of course, sexual activity in this context is also broadly defined. It could be anything from hugging and kissing all the way to intercourse and everything in between. So as you can see, the research definition and Wass's own definition overlap with some pretty minor variations. Wass's definition is more educationally focused and therefore is encouraging verbal communication, while the research definition acknowledges that people can use nonverbal means to communicate consent as well. Otherwise, they're pretty similar. So let's talk a little bit about research. But when it comes to reviewing the research on sexual consent, we need a way to organize it in a meaningful way. So today I'm going to use script theory, sexual scripting theory, as a way of organizing, arranging, and sorting all the many different influences on sexual consent negotiations, or what we might call challenges. And what the research says, briefly, about each of those. Another really good organizing tool or approach could be to use Bronfenbrenner's ecological model of societal influences on the individual. And I might take that approach and talk more about that approach during the WAS Congress in November. So stay tuned for that. That's a very shameless plug for my own talk at WAS in November. So come to Turkey. So according to the scripting theory, and the fathers of scripting theory are John Gagnon and William Simon, our behavior is really shaped by scripts, which guide and instruct our understanding of how we should act. What is appropriate for us to do, what is not appropriate socially for us to do. Individual behavior is influenced by 3 levels of social scripting that can also be subsequently mapped onto sexual scripting. So let's start with cultural scripts. So the focus here is on the societal level, how we are socialized, within our own culture. These are the social messages, the norms that we understand to be true. Cultural scripts represent then the prescribed roles within society that dictate which behaviors are appropriate for each person. So for example, I could ask, what are the messages about gender that are instilled in us from when we are very young? You know, what are we told are the roles for women and men within our society? And what are we told are not the roles for women and men in our society? What messages do we receive about sexuality in general? Typically that it's a kind of a taboo topic that we shouldn't be discussing. We live in a kind of sex negative culture A lot of us do. What messages do young people receive about their own budding sexuality? Well, don't do it. Abstain. That it's dangerous. We talk to young people about the dangers of pregnancy, the dangers of unwanted pregnancy, the dangers of STIs. We don't talk to them about the pleasures. How do you think all of these messages that we get from the culture translate into an individual's ability to negotiate sexual consent with their partner? Remember, these are deeply entrenched, ingrained messages about the sexual roles that women and men play in society. Messages about male dominance and men as initiators of sex, their entitlement to it. Messages about women as chaste, as the gatekeepers and protectors of their own sexuality. And in many ways, it's set up as a form of competition or a game, even. So here we can look to attitude research, as well as some of the behavioral research, to see what are the norms and expectations that people have within any particular segment of society. So the attitude research has found a number of things. Number one, talking about your own personal sexual wants, needs, and desires with a partner is awkward for a great many people. As a result of this, we are also more likely to negotiate sexual consent using then indirect and non-verbal tactics or approaches that don't require us to be vulnerable sexually. And these types of approaches, unfortunately, are also more likely to be misunderstood, misconstrued by a partner or others because they are less clear. There are some gender differences in sexual consent attitudes that are in line with these cultural sexual scripts for women and men. For instance, women agree more than men that asking for consent is important. They want that. And men agree more that the longer the relationship is, the less need there is for any kind of explicit consent negotiation. Men are more likely than women to rely on nonverbal cues to interpret and communicate consent, and women are more likely to rely on verbal cues to interpret and communicate consent. This difference is not vast. There's a significant amount of overlap, but there is some findings to suggest a gender difference. Generally speaking, the more sexually experienced the couple is together, the less likely people think that they need to negotiate consent. This is a precedence argument, right? Once a behavior is established and becomes expected, there's no need to renegotiate that behavior. And this extends to consent. There's been some evidence of both in the attitude and the behavioral research that a precedence argument does exist with respect to consent. And consent attitudes among gender and sexual minority students find that gender and sexual minority students report higher support for sexual consent and sexual consent behaviors, which likely comes because they are, and in comparison to their cisgendered heterosexual students, comparator group, and it's likely because they are less entrenched in these societal gendered norms. Now, you would think, okay, if this has to do with cultural messaging, there's been a lot of more positive cultural messaging around consent recently. So you would think with all the news and the education around sexual consent, maybe some of these cultural scripts are changing. However, what seems to be happening is that there's a disconnect now between students' attitudes, which when reported from researchers seem to be very pro-consent, very much we should be doing all of these things, to be very clear. There's a disconnect between those attitudes and their actual behavior. Researchers have coded open-ended descriptions of students' sexual experiences from beginning to end with new and long-term partners. And they were looking for descriptions of kind of spontaneous consent-related behavior. So they wanted people to generate these spontaneously to demonstrate that it's actually part of the script that people are using. But the results suggest that direct discussions of sexual consent are exceedingly rare, and that sexual interactions typically include a lot of indirect, veiled, or coded behavior that required a lot of interpretation. So the bottom line is that affirmative consent, which we take as the kind of holy grail of behaviors in most of these consent education programming and campaigns, is not yet integrated into the interpersonal sexual scripts and day-to-day sexual experiences of young adults. Behavior is still being guided by the traditional cultural scripts that are very resistant to change. Now, keep in mind that adolescents and young adults don't use nonverbal or indirect methods because they think they're better communication tactics. The strangest part of this research is that students rated direct verbal or nonverbal signals as the most indicative of consent. The direct behaviors and signals are the most indicative of consent, which means they know that they are the clearest. But the paradox is that when it comes to actually using them in real life situations, that they are the last approach that students will use. They will start with the most indirect behaviors first before moving to more direct approaches. Okay, so I've covered a lot of what I will consider the cultural messaging that's out there and how it may influence individual sexual consent behavior. Let's talk a little bit about the interpersonal level of scripting. So John Gagnon and Bill Simon suggested that the interpersonal level of scripting is really at the level of negotiation with another person. So when you are ready to engage in sexual activity, you are talking to that other person and trying to negotiate consent on a face-to-face approach. This level of scripting actually allows for some variability in the script. So they're not all rigid coming from the culture. So there's variation in the script so that one's identity, one's personality, as well as the scripts from the partner can all conform or not to societal expectations. So they'll be a little bit malleable with each other and with the various individualized scenarios that couples find themselves in, the context, right? And it is that level of interpersonal scripting that we can conduct research on how people actually interpret sexual consent signals from another person. So that's the research where we look at how do people interpret signals from another? And based on different kinds of manipulation, different contexts, does that interpretation differ? How accurate are we in our interpretation of all these subtle, indirect, nonverbal cues, for example? Right? And what are the variables that influence that interpretation? So let me start with the length of the relationship or the level of sexual experience that the couple may have. There may be significant impacts on how people interpret or obtain sexual consent depending on the length of the relationship and the sexual experience. We know that it matters because in qualitative studies about consent, participants say things like, oh, we've been together for a long time, so I don't need to ask for or give my consent. And if you ask them, you follow up and you ask, well, how do you know you have consent from your partner? They'll reply with things like, oh, I just know, or it's easy to tell. And those are the kinds of things that frustrate researchers, but speak to the point that consent changes over time with relationships. It is not a static behavior. It is not the same for the couple that's just hooked up, in which it might be more deliberate and explicit, as it is with the couple who have been together for years. The ironic part about that actually is I have done focus groups on individuals who are in hookup situations, who they don't really know their partners all that well. And they say they don't talk very much to their partners, they're not very explicit in that context because they're really worried about rejection. So they continue to use indirect nonverbal approaches to figuring out whether their partner's interested. And then if you talk to couples in long-term relationships, they say, well, we've been together long enough, we can read each other fairly easily, so we don't need to engage in any explicit direct consent negotiations. So I'm not sure exactly where it does happen. If it does, where that negotiation, that discussion, that explicit direct negotiation does occur. We'll leave that for another day. The long-term couple likely has a very idiosyncratic, nonverbal approach to understanding consent in their relationship that they've honed over a number of years together. Another interesting contextual piece here is the level of alcohol use during sexual activity. It influences how consent is negotiated. Absolutely. We know we know alcohol is ubiquitous on college and university campuses. And I'm not a legal scholar, but it seems to me that there's been very little guidance has been provided in terms of a clear threshold for where intoxication negates a person's ability to consent or capacity to consent, short of being completely out of control in terms of your own actions or unconscious. But where is that line? Because a lot of our sexual consent education campaigns talk about alcohol as if you've had any, you can't consent. But that's not clear across the legal jurisdictions in many countries, including Canada. So in terms of Canada, for example, the terminology is if you are incapacitated by alcohol, then you cannot give your consent. But there have been a number of rulings actually to suggest that, yes, in fact, you can have some alcohol in your system and be able to consent to sexual activity. So that throws a little bit of a wrench into some of the campaigns. Sure, we want to be of sound mind, but it does appear like the courts have suggested there's some level of alcohol intake that is okay. That's getting very controversial, but that's what's happening right now, at least in Canada. But clearly there has been a very long history of drunk, consensual sex among students and non-students alike. However, alcohol certainly exacerbates quite a number of issues, right? It changes the perception of people's sexual intent. It increases in people who do consume alcohol, even if you have participants in studies who are sober, looking at couples who are drinking, or a scenario in which the couple is drinking, those sober people interpret more sexual intent to those people because they are drinking. Ambiguous nonverbal cues are more likely also to be perceived as consent in those situations. So interpretation of cues is heightened. And alcohol also influences decision-making processes, like the assessment of risk when it comes to sexual activity. So alcohol changes a very significant number of dynamics within the sexual activity scenario. Another contextual piece, I have a former master's student, Ray McKee, who conducted a study on sexual consent negotiations in men who have sex with men, and gathered data across Canada, the US, and in Europe. And his results actually turned out to be quite disturbing, concerning, I would say, demonstrating some lack of consent, very little verbal discussions, negotiating consent, fairly high rates of aggressive sexuality, in which all the men are assumed to be kind of hypersexual and always wanting sex. So those are some of the cultural scripts within that subgroup in which there is a hypersexual level of understanding and this idea that everybody's ready and always wanting sexual situations. Many of the men talked about very difficult, unwanted sexual situations that they needed to deal with, especially in contexts that assumed sexuality. So in these heightened sexual contexts, like a bathhouse or a dark room or the dance club, for example, these are situations in which everyone is assumed to be willing and able, and therefore consent is not asked. So the context makes a difference. And then I can talk a little bit about BDSM here as well as another context in which it actually could be very informative with respect to sexual consent practices within the BDSM kink community. Bondage, dominance, sadomasochistic behaviors. The BDSM community has a documented reputation for more stringent standards around consent, for extensive educational procedures in their community, and high self-policing regarding sexual communication and consent. And it may be the case that sexual consent is different among BDSM participants than it is among the general public. Maybe we could actually learn a lot about how to explicitly negotiate consent from those in the BDSM community. I have a study going on right now with a current master's student, Jessica, exploring this very topic. And I just want to make one comment here about the context that we're talking about here. And again, I want to bring it back to many contexts in many countries around the world. Consent is still a concept for the privileged. With rampant forms of gender-based violence occurring, homophobia, genital mutilation, forced marriages, still very prevalent in different areas around the globe, some people may find it incredibly hard to understand how consent could operate in their own context. In places where basic sexual health is still a struggle, let alone these larger concepts of sexual and reproductive justice, consent may still be just a very fancy word from the West. So I want to recognize that obvious point that global inequities don't afford us all the same agency when discussing consent. Okay, so we've talked about the cultural scripts, and now we've talked about the interpersonal level of scripts. There's one final level of scripting that John Gagnon and William Simon talked about, and that has to do with the intrapersonal scripting level. And this is really the most central script to the self. This is comprising the person's own feelings, desires, wants, and needs, which might be similar or different from the cultural level of norms that are out there, as well as the ones that are from your partner, the understanding from the partner. So this is a category where we could discuss all sorts of personality characteristics that might influence how people negotiate sexual consent. Examples include those who are socially or chronically shy, those who are erotophobic, which is kind of a negative affiliation with sex in general, those who are narcissistic, and not necessarily a personality characteristic, but those who are potentially highly religious in one way or another. How do we get these people to establish sexual consent explicitly and verbally with their partners? Actually, some of the educational programs being promoted regarding sexual consent suggest that not only should individuals be explicit and affirmative, but they should also be enthusiastic. And I can quickly see some problems or challenges with that advice, given the range of personality characteristics that we have amongst the population. There's also the point about ambivalence. Another issue with giving a distinct yes or a no answer is that people may experience ambivalent feelings when it comes to their sexual involvement. Ambivalent is when you hold both positive and negative feelings at once. Asserting that a person should use direct, explicit, verbal consent to sexual activity assumes that they either absolutely want to engage in sexual activity or they absolutely do not want to engage. It's asking people to reduce their emotions to clearly defined categories, when this is often not the case. Researchers have indicated that they're upwards of 80%, so the vast majority of their samples, these are usually college men and women, university level, they report at least one episode of ambivalence to participating in sexual activity. So there's high rates of ambivalence out there. Other researchers have noted that adolescent girls experience multiple emotions, describing their desire, but also feelings of vulnerability, physically, psychologically, interpersonally. So again, both positive and negative feelings. And therefore, it's not always a straightforward case of wanting or not wanting sexual activity, or wanted or unwanted sexual activity. Not always an easy yes or no, and especially not an easy decision that can be made before the sexual event starts, which is what a lot of the programming and campaigns around consent argue should happen. And then there's also the last point I am raising here is there's a difference between consenting to sexual behavior and wanting sexual behavior. So there's a distinction. People can make personal decisions about engaging in sexual activity based on either one of those, their want or their consent. Although most instances of consenting sex are wanted, sometimes people will consent to sex that they don't want and want sex that they will not consent to. Those things can happen. The distinction between wanting sex and consenting to sex is still not entirely clear at the cultural level, let alone at the interpersonal level. And currently, I think that the two concepts are still quite conflated in the general population. Everything we think we want, we've consented to, we want, and everything we've consented to, we've wanted. That's not necessarily the case. I have a study going on right now, again, that is looking at whether individuals can actually distinguish between the two in scenarios in which they believe is most important. So I'll get back to you in due time with that as well. So let's talk a little bit about implications for education. So what are the implications from all of this discussion today around sex education? Well, if we accept sexual script theory and its different levels of scripting within the culture and within ourselves, then it's clear that specific sexual consent education is not enough. It's too narrow. We need sex-positive, comprehensive sex education from birth to death to combat and ultimately change the sex-negative cultural messages currently being promoted. WSHD's declaration of sexual pleasure, their declaration of sexual rights, and the call for sexual justice are good steps in the right direction. So I think I have set up a great discussion for our panel to take off and the Q&A that's going to happen after that, with a significant number of open questions that I've posed that researchers have yet to deal with here. Suffice to say is we all have our hands full attempting to provide a very sex-positive, sexual consent educational experience to the next generation of global citizens. So I do thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to hearing the feedback on this wonderful, wonderful panel and our discussion overall with respect to World Sexual Health Day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Terry. Isn't it wonderful to hear from a true expert and to hear all of the nuances of this topic that has been discussed in so much depth, but it just shows you that he has given us a lot of food for thought. So first, I will go over to you, Lynn Barkley, who is the chair of the World Sexual Health Day Committee, and to just give us a word on how your perception of World Sexual Health Day this year, and hearing what Terry has said, and setting the stage for this panel discussion. I'll let you open it.
Thank you so much, Elna and Terry. That was really an amazing talk. So when I joined WAS, I quickly became the chair of the World Sexual Health Day. And as a 100-year-old nonprofit working on sexual health, this was like, thank you so much, a gift. This year, consent was interesting to me because I had people telling me we don't need to do consent because we understand consent, at which point, no, we have a lot to learn on this very, very important topic. And I learned a whole lot just listening to Terry, because there's so many aspects of the subject that really we need to be thinking about, and giving people the tools they need, as he said, through the life course. So thank you for joining us today. And those of you who will watch this later, this is a very important topic. And any suggestions, we're considering next year's theme. And so if somebody says, you know what, we really need to be doing this, just let us know. Okay. And go to the World Sexual Health Day.org website. There's tons of tools for you. In some of the tools are in multiple languages. So take a look. All right. Thank you. And thank you again, Elna.
No, thank you, Lynn, and thank you so much for driving this process. Lynn just got her team involved, and they've really made fantastic resources. I just saw that on WHO's social media feed, they use the resources that Lynn and her team have made for World Sexual Health Day to explain consent. And that's exactly what we want, that you also go to your local audience and use these resources and get a conversation about consent going. Terry's talk is fabulously academic because he is one of the world's top academics on this, and we respect you as colleagues and professionals in sexual health here, and make this particular WAS Sexual Health Day event quite academic. But it's important that we also take this message out into the most basic levels of education and educate everybody about it. So I am going to read a first question here from the Q&A. You are more than welcome to put questions in the Q&A. Our panel is here to answer this. So it says that the WAS Declaration of Sexual Rights in Article 2 asserts that the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person. And Article 3 asserts the right to autonomy and bodily integrity. The world has brought attention to female genital cutting as a violation of these principles, and the cutting of children's genitals is primarily an issue of consent. When will these same rights be asserted for boys who are subjected to non-consensual genital cutting, in other words, circumcision, around the world? And as we all know, this is a very loaded topic, and because it has extremely strong religious and cultural undertones, but I can assure you that as the World Association for Sexual Health, who is a laboratory of ideas and who like to be trailblazers and really thought leaders on this field, we have invited Brian Erb, a world expert on this topic, to be a keynote speaker at the WAS Congress in Antalya. And we are certainly also putting together a panel discussion, particularly on this subject. And I agree with you, Leif, who posted this question, that this is something that really needs to be addressed in depth. But because WAS has not really engaged in consultation on this, and we are formulating our ideas, I think I'll tread carefully to ask the whole panel to comment on this particular issue. But what I can tell you is we hear you. There is a very interesting question here that I've actually already asked Kristen Mark to look at. Kristen, do you want to maybe summarize this question for us, or do you want me to read out the next question?
Sure, I can summarize, no problem. There was a question related to same-sex sexual activity and transactional sex, and whether Dr. Humphreys has looked into the vagueness on consent in same-sex sexual activity and whether that's come up in his research. And I think he spoke a little bit to this. I can't say whether or not this has directly come up in his research. I can speak to my own research and say that it certainly has come up in my research, especially as we think about what the meaning of transactional sex is and how transactional sex happens all the time in a lot of different ways, right? Looking at longer term relationships, it happens in that context of engaging in sex for a particular exchange of some sort between long-term partners. And it does happen in the same-sex sexual activity communities as well, very often, but not necessarily in different ways or in ways that change the definition of consent, I guess is what I'd like to conclude with there is like that definition of consent, although there can be these nuanced areas of consent, is universal regardless of the sort of cultural context or the context within which someone is, the types of sexual behaviors that someone is engaging in. So I'd be curious to hear from Terry Humphreys on whether that's come up in his research, but in mine it certainly has, and I think we need to pay attention to those nuances. So that doesn't fully answer your question, but I hope that sparks a little bit of something in others to think about that a little more.
And that it sparks the interest of our audience to come to Antalya and speak to Terry. We will also in Antalya definitely have a panel and more of a deeper engagement onto consent, since it is our theme for this year. I want to move on to another question that I want to direct at you, Mehmet. As a therapist, Mehmet is a psychiatrist and a cognitive behavioral therapist, and this is about talking. So this is why I'm directing it to you. It seems like the ability to engage in overt or verbal consent relies on one's comfort level of talking about sex. As efforts to remove any talk of sexuality from education. I think it's US efforts. Oh, yes. The US efforts to remove any talk of sexuality from education directly impacts and perhaps can be seen as a direct assault on a young person's ability to engage in consent. So, if we see this massive backlash against comprehensive sexuality education, and we are engaging with WHO and various other agencies at the moment, particularly on this topic. So some people think children should not be taught how to talk about consent. But Mehmet, starting with you, what is your take on this?
To be honest, when I think it was 1992 or 1991, where we wanted to start sexual education in schools, depending on the age groups. So there was a person who was a scientist, also a clinician, who was not psychiatrist or psychologist, but he was also had good links with the government. So let me talk about our own experience. So he collected all of us together, and he wanted us to make booklets, because in school, when children ask questions to their teachers used to say, go and ask it to your mom. And when they asked to their mom, they said, go and ask it to your teachers. So the children had the message that this question should not be asked. So although we say that the sexual education starts from the born baby to until death, the teachers are not well identified. Most of the sexual educations happens on the street. So from ear to ear, that kind of stuff. So what we did was we made a book for students only on different age groups, for teachers, and then for parents as well, so that they can start speaking the language, what they should know between 3 and 7, 7 and 10, and then of course early teenager, late teenager, middle. And so it was a big book. So everybody, and we started training of the trainers. So we started training the trainers in schools so that they can train all of the schools, and it becomes a network all around the country. So it started like that. After a couple of years, unfortunately, there was some kind of, when you start educating people, of course, there are some barriers to that. Some parents say, we don't want our children to go into that kind of classes. Some people say this should not be compulsory, it should be chosen. That's understandable. Some people said, even we didn't have a standard between the trainers. Some of the trainers thought that girls and boys should be trained on separate kind of occasions. not because they were conservative, but they thought that the young girls was not able to ask questions in front of the boys. And then we started talking about homosexuality. On those times, it was called transgender, transsexuality. So we talked about those things as well. So everything was included. And no, actually, even the Ministry of Education supported this. And there were some volunteers to support it. As time went by, instead of talking about more and more about these issues, we came to a point where some authorities started telling us, can we remove this part of the chapter from your book, which was about, let's say, homosexuality, then about, we were just left with the insects or biology of sexuality, let's put it that way, as time went by. Instead of being advanced, it was going back and back. And so obviously, when you start education, it is not only a matter of Ministry of Education, it's a matter of Ministry of Health, Ministry of, lots of different kind of, in the country, ministries and some authorities need to have a consensus. So first of all, you need to have the training of the trainers, training of the need that these gaps should be filled by, appropriate information, using the acceptable language, because, the way that the trainer speaks, some of these refers to these, names to genitals or to different things, becomes a role model for the others. So we can't be colloquial, but also we cannot be too scientific. So we started to do all these things. So I totally believe that the more you're comfortable, the question was like that, I guess I didn't read the question, but from the way you put it, I understand that if you're more comfortable and sex positive in terms of being able to talk freely, verbally or non-verbally, especially verbally on sexual issues, then it becomes easier to ask for consent, because you understand that. I think there was a very important point where Terry said consent and wanting are two different things, not necessarily the same. I think this is a very important issue. Once you give a consent, doesn't mean that you accept every kind of, because what kind of consent do you get to what behavior? So this becomes a very important issue. So I think, yes, it is. The more you're comfortable with being able to talk when you're younger, when you learn about values, not only about, because this world today is full with aims and goals, but no values. So there's a lot of information, but no wisdom. Let's put it that way. So people have information. So having information is not good enough. I think we need to teach something from life. And the schools are there, aren't they? I mean, for making people ready for their future lives. And sex is one part of their future lives. So why shouldn't they learn it in schools? I think this is a very important issue. And one last issue that I want to bring and ask it to you and to all of the panelists, if you give me the permission for that, is that when Terry was talking about the components of this consent, he was referring to interpersonal and interpersonal kind of, components. Well, sometimes these interfere very well with each other. Like imagine a little boy or a little girl, or a child, let's put it that way. He's only 2, 3, whatever, or whoever it is, and he says, I want chocolates, and starts crying. And mommy says, sorry, no chocolates before you have the dinner. So he starts crying, he starts anger bursts, and mother says, sorry, I'm not going to listen to these theatrical, dramatical stuff. So you are not likely to have the chocolates until you have your food. So the boy, the authentic side of the boy, which is the interpersonal part, says, I want chocolates because it's the desired object, and you want to go for the desired object. But then you have your mom there, who is the bonding object. And obviously the boy or the girl or whoever, they need to make a choice. And soon or later understands that needs to make a choice between the desired object and the bonding object. So realizes that I have to go for it, and then goes for the mother, of course, because the bonding object is more necessary for the child. And then life carries on like that. As you go bigger, older, mature, you make a choice between your authentic self, interpersonal part, and make a choice, or you go for the interpersonal part and say, if I choose this, this will happen. So this becomes a matter of conflict all of the time. And that is because you need to make a choice. But what people need, because people have the longest relationship with themselves, which is the authenticity is being in touch with yourself, isn't it? So you are in the longest relationship is the one that you establish with yourself. But unfortunately, there are always choices between the authentic side and, of course, between the interpersonal or the environmental. So you go for one. But we always forget that we don't have to make a choice for a lifetime. We can be both, bonding, but keeping the attachment as well. So instead of making a choice between attachment or bonding or authenticity, you can authentically bond with other people. But this becomes a very important issue, I think, in all of the cultures. So I guess thinking about all these predictors of consent are interrelated to each other, not really isolated from each other, but all of them are together, including the cultural issues as well. So I don't know what the other panelists think. I hope that I could have answered at least some part of the question. I didn't get the rest, but I hope this is understandable.
Now, that's very interesting, Mehmet. I thank you. And for you as a therapist, your insights into the developmental side of consent was particularly interested to me. Kristen, maybe I'm going to come back to you to comment on the next question that's also related to CSE, and then we'll come back. But then maybe you can also comment, as a therapist, I think you'll be in the best position to elaborate on that comment of Mehmet about the authentic self and the interplay between that and how people then end up to actually hopefully mostly make the right decisions. And something that's important to venture into is, but if they don't, where is the sexual justice for those who have made the wrong decisions? And how is there that reparation, which is something that we're talking about now in WAS in terms of sexual justice. I'll come back to you with that, Kristen, but first I want to go to Esther Corona with this a question about comprehensive sexuality education. It says, thank you for addressing this important topic. My first remark is that we have to take consent out of the sexual sphere to any interpersonal interaction. My question is the following. Comprehensive sexuality education programs have to integrate consent. How can those programs integrate the notion appropriately? Esther, you are the expert on this, so I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. And I will also take some of Mehmet's comments on sexuality education within school settings. I think this is one of the easiest things to teach very young children. And the International Technical Guidance of Sexuality Education, which was developed by UN agencies led by UNESCO and others, including WAS, shows very clearly how this can be done, because through 8 key concepts. And all these key concepts are not isolated, they're integrated. So you're teaching based on rights. But we have to focus sometimes on the sexual part, because of course consent refers not only to sexuality, but refers to many other spheres in life. And sometimes what happens is that what is taught is completely outside. Consent on using a sweater, consent on wearing certain clothes, but there are very important issues. For instance, when parents, which develop into more sexual behavior in later years, things like kissing. The aunt comes, or the grandmother, and kisses the child, and the child says no. And the mother and father and family say, oh, but how can you reject your family? This is something that it has to be done. But when you teach slowly from the very beginning, bodily autonomy, and that is also tied to gender, because it's not isolated from how you teach young boys, well, children, boys and little girls. It's different in different cultures. So you have to start also working with communities, parents, families, and of course, school authorities. But I mean, there are ways, and many countries have been developing these guidelines and adapting it to their own cultures, respecting culture, but at the same time challenging it. It's very important that the sexual norms should be challenged when they go against basic not only basic sexual rights, but basic sexual rights understood as human rights. So this is something that in each country and within each culture has to be developed in a very specific way, taking into account these things, and also taking into account that you're using science. I mean, being scientific is not something that it's so elaborated, so foreign to a child. It's how it's so. How do you teach the proper names for body parts? How and this, for instance, preschool teachers sometimes they do it through songs, play, and many other activities. So this is something that very much has to be done. And also because it's also linked to certain kinds of violence and prevention also of sexual abuse. And this is something that I think that most education ministries and most governments are interested in, and they are willing to not only to hear, but to participate in developing a really comprehensive sexuality education for their children and young people. And I think, just let me a very interesting sideline. This has become a political issue. I mean, something like what happened in Spain recently with kissing, with something that was, something that seemed to be very cultural. It has been now challenged. It has been when a young female football player was kissed by a manager or trainer or whoever. And I mean, without asking permission. And that is very important. If this is taught throughout childhood, early childhood, and through adolescence, people with boys and girls, young girls and boys, will be empowered to say yes when they want to say yes, and to be sure that no means no.
Spoken like a true expert. Thank you, Esther. You are exactly right. Thank you for that and for all of your experience in sharing it. And I really do want to echo, I do think most governments do want to do this. And it is really sad that parents and civil society are often opposing it when there's so much research to back this. Kristen, this is also something that you actually do research on. So over to you for some comments on that.
Yeah, thanks. So related to the question and the note that it needs to be taken outside of sex, I think we can start with just bodily autonomy, right? Teaching children at very young ages about bodily autonomy sets the stage and creates the foundation from which sexual consent becomes a natural component of sex. And so of anything. And so I think by totally taking the sex out of it, like bodily autonomy comes first and can be applied to so many different issues. And if we could just teach that and integrate that into systems, then I think that we would go a really long way in our approaches to consent. So for example, like my nephews have recently, I'll go up as their aunt and I'll give them a big hug and they'll be squirming away from me and not want me to give them a hug. So I've stopped doing that because I do want them to know that they do have charge of their own body. And so instead I ask them, can I get a hug? And if I can't, then I give them a fist pump instead. Like, it's just very simple. And I have to stop myself in those moments. But those very simple moments of like shifting your perspective to bodily autonomy and starting at a very young age helps build that culture of consent that we're certainly missing in the United States, certainly missing in Canada, certainly missing in several other nations. And that bodily autonomy piece is important. The other piece that I wanted to build upon is this difference between experiencing feelings of regret from a decision made and that balance with that feeling of having been taken advantage of or been violated. And that's a very important distinction. And I talk to, when I have clients who come to me with sexual trauma issues or with we do a lot of work around like talking about that component of it, of having, it's okay to experience the feeling of regret and that not be the same feeling as this like taken advantage of, feeling violated. And that that seems to be something that people can distinguish. The piece that comes out in my research is one thing that we've done some research on is looking at people who have experienced sexual trauma and how they get into a healthy, happy sex life after the fact, and how consent is so critical to that. Feeling like you have control over your own body is so critical to that, but also that the key to being able to experience sexual pleasure after experiencing sexual trauma lies in consent and in this feeling of being able to advocate for oneself in a sexual situation and voice one's sexual needs and feel safe, like a sense of that sexual safety. So that it touches upon each one of those, and I'll turn it back over to see if anyone else has anything to add to that.
Thank you, Kristen. And that what you said about your nephews, what I see in Africa is we expect that 16-year-old girl who's highly aroused, who actually wants to react on her bodily responses, to just say no. But we don't teach adults to don't cross boundaries. We as adults don't keep ourselves back from giving that hug when we really want it. And as simple as not going like this when your nephew doesn't want to hug you. I also have a 4 and a 6-year-old, and I catch myself doing that, asking, can I please get a kiss? And if they say no, I make that face, and it's atrocious because you socialize them into actually keeping the other happy. And Terry also spoke about that, and of course Mehmet spoke a lot about it. So Mehmet, what you said made me think about how they would choose me as the primary one that they bond with, but it just speaks so loudly to power and how atrocious power is, and even power that seems so innocent in your own household, and how we can violate other people's rights to consent from our power. Sure. Okay. So there's a question from Esther Pirelli Benestad that I want to ask, that I want to raise here. It says, Esben Esther is one of the Secretary Generals of WAS and the chair of our Trans and Gender Diversity Committee. So I just want to raise their question here. It says, consent is also a challenge for cultures that do not always consent to what we are talking about right now. Likewise, there are people around us whose very existence is not celebrated by cultural consent. There seems to be a growing issue, not only in the US. Consent in everyday life is closely linked to trust. A trusting relationship will possible consent with fewer signals. So I think that is, in Esben Esther's poetic way, a comment on what we are saying about this cultural consent to some people's mere existence. And I don't know if any one of you maybe want to make a comment about that. Cultural consent. Mehmet, I think in Turkey, you deal with that, because in the more societies where for instance, queer rights have been advocated for a longer time, it is a little bit more accepted, and then you get, it goes into the opposite direction in the end. But what do you experience with cultural consent in your country, Mehmet?
It's when you say culture, to be honest, our culture is not one single one. It's not a single entity, subcultures and so on. So when you refer to Turkey, referring to a certain culture would be ignoring the rest of the subcultures. So I guess there are lots of different kinds of people. But what Esben Esther over there tries to ask, I understand, is she's referring to trust. And then when there's trust, of course, the consent, I don't know, maybe Esben Esther can tell us more, but what I understand is, to me, trust is consistency over time. So if you're consistent over time, that brings trust, so it takes time, it takes effort. So when you have trust, of course, you don't really ask for consent. This is really something else. You just automatically assume that the other person is going to accept whatever you do. Like we're talking on a kind of theoretical basis in here, but in different cultures, let's imagine my son who's not giving a cuddle for his granddad will be offended, and he's very old, and I know that it's my dad, and if he doesn't cuddle his grandchildren, who is he going to cuddle? He's got no one else. So I think in real life, sometimes you make a distinction, you make a kind of decision, let's put it that way, between the authentic self and also the environment. So this is always a handicap. It's always a kind of, making a choice. But every choice makes you sorry because you haven't made the other choice, which you could have made. So every choice comes with regret, maybe. And I think regret is only in the human being. Christine touched to regret. To me, regret with one word is the price of knowing. Yeah. When you know something, you regret. Animals don't regret when they come to the street and the street, diverts into two ways, either left or right. You make a choice, you go right. As human beings, when we go right, if we have some kind of difficulties on that road, we start thinking to each other, shit, I should have chosen the other way. None of the animals wouldn't do that. They would go. And so we have to learn that it's not, life is only about doing what you really want to do, but it's liking the things you do instead of, doing always the things that you like. So in this sense, sometimes we make our decisions. We also have to teach our children to be safe, but also, when we're talking about body and bodily, autonomy and so on, of course, we need to think about the other people as well. We need to think about our own environment, about our own culture, subculture, family culture, but we need to have, that's the reason why I touched to values. Values is part of it, very important part of it, because instead of having goals to protect and so on, sometimes you become paranoid. I mean, I have to tell that in some cultures, even coming and talking to you, a different person, when I was younger, when I had my training in UK, when I was talking to a little boy, the parents suddenly comes and starts, this is my son. I say, sorry, I understand. So you feel kind of, there's no, how can I say, you don't have the intimacy. We need intimacy as human beings, as much as we need privacy as well. So there should be a balance. There should be it's easy to talk about theoretically, but when it comes to real life experiences, things change. And we need to protect people from being abused, but we have to not to make them afraid of being themselves and make them touch with their own authentic selves as well. Because otherwise, well, sometimes we come to a point where we make people paranoid. Our lives are only as large as our connections. And when you don't have these intimacy, sometimes you have no connections. So it is very important to make a distinction. It's very important to make a decision. It's very important to teach them how to decide. Everybody talks about leaving a better world behind. The world has been the same. It's neither good nor bad. It's the same. But we have to leave better children to the world to make the world better. So when they are doing this, of course, the world is not global. We have globalization, but we have cultures, subcultures, and so on. So there's not one single answer. I think everything depends on the context. Without the context, none of the answers are correct. Every theory proves to be wrong given time. Let's put it that way.
Very interesting. Thank you for your insights, Mehmet. I'll just start wrapping it up now, and with a very important comment that also ties in with what some of the others have been saying here. And this is from Marlene Wasserman, who's a sexologist from South Africa, and I know very, very concerned with trauma-informed care. And she speaks to, considering the very high rates of childhood sexual abuse, children grow into adults who struggle with consent. Any ideas on how to manage this? And I know that Kristen has touched on it a little bit, and Mehmet has also, but maybe I can just give you a short closing remark, Kristen, on this as a researcher and therapist, and then after you, I'll pass it straight back to Esther Corona for a closing remark, and then to Lynn, and then we will end off the webinar. Thank you, Kristen.
Sure. Yes. So I would like to actually spend more time hearing from our other panelists. Like Lynn, I'd be very curious how you've seen this play out in the work that you've been doing as well. But I think overall it is simple at the same time as being complicated, and I think that has been the pattern that we've seen in the research in like even just defining consent. That has been a journey that I think researchers have struggled with, to also in practice and how we integrate it into sex education. I think making it the backbone of sex education is critical and is something that will allow us to advance sex education efforts across the board. And framing it in that way helps, at least within the context that I work in, getting the funding to do that, right? And so this is another way that we can see how important consent is, and how universally important it is. So I'll pass it on to one of the others with our limited time.
Okay, Esther?
Yes. Well, I just want to make a closing remark in general. The fact that we really have to do more research, look more at best practices, try to understand also what Mehmet has addressed, which is cultural context. And because it has, consent has very different meaning, even in languages. It has a completely different, it's very nuanced, but it's something that is coming into the forefront of public attention. And that is very good. That is very good because it's now not assumed that people are having consent and even, young women, they were taught that they were holding the key to consent. That's putting the whole burden on young women on how to navigate relationships. This is changing. And thank you very much for all the people who are doing research. And thank you very much for Ross and for bringing this into World Sexual Health Day, because having traveled through so many different issues, problems, and also celebrations, I think this is a very good turning point also to study what we are going to be doing in Antalya, which is sexual justice.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Esther. Lynn?
I will be very, very brief. So ASHA, the American Sexual Health Association, has been working to really help parents know how to talk about sex with their kids, right? And how to understand their kids' developmental needs. And so I think everything that has been said here today is absolutely on point. We need to be doing a better job giving people the tools, lots and lots of people, the tools that they need, because this problem should not really exist, but it does. So thank you. It's been a great World Sexual Health Day.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks to you. Thanks again to your committee, but I'll end off with a thanks. I just want to give Mehmet one last word, and then I'll end it off. Mehmet?
Elna, thanks very much. It was a pleasure to be with all of you, and thanks to the audience for staying with us for such a long time. And my last, of course, predictable sentence will be, come and join us in Antalya, and let's discuss about this, because we are the people who are talking here, but we want to be as interactive as possible. I always believe in learning. When I make a presentation, I always learn from the audience. So I believe in learning together, and growing in diversity. So please come and join us, and let's make it a memorable Congress. Thanks for arranging this wonderful day, Elna, to everybody, and it's always a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mehmet. I will first thank the people who thought of starting World Sexual Health Day under the leadership of Rosemary Coates way back when. As I said, it's the 14th time that we are celebrating World Sexual Health Day. And Fernando Bianco, who was here tonight as a past president of CBO, Louise Perelman, Those are people who are still very much involved with WAS that envisioned this years ago. And it's wonderful to see how the whole world is celebrating World Sexual Health Day. And again, thank you, as my co-panelists said, to all of our attendees here. And I particularly want to thank the likes of Beverly Whipple and Jacqueline Bendler and some other of our colleagues that have already, been so involved with WAS and have gone on into in retirement or into their other organizations. But we continue to value your support, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you to our Federation presidents. I saw that Felipe was here as the president of FLASES, and to all of the other people who said hello and for joining us. And I look forward to seeing some of you that I know have submitted abstracts to Antalya, to learn from you in Antalya, and particularly to engage with you on a very much social level in Antalya. Then I would like to thank Michelle in the background. Michelle, you host fantastic webinars. Thank you for your service. Thank you to Renee for putting things together for us as the executive director, and of course to our panelists. I thank you for your time. As I always say, it's the one resource that's completely unrenewable, and it is completely impossible for WAS to really thank you for what you do for WAS. So as members of the WAS Advisory Committee, I thank you for your time for WAS in general, but particularly here tonight, it has been a very meaningful engagement. And then I'll end off with a thank you to my co-officers at WAS, Alan Jami, our Vice President, Louis Perelman, for their unwavering support and what they do for WAS, and also to the Extended Advisory Committee. Thank you so much to everyone. I wish you a happy and consensual World Sexual Health Day. Good night.